All right, good morning. Thanks for being here today. I'm happy to be here. Hope you'll forgive me for taking my jacket off already. It's awful warm in here. So, your mission statement should define you. And this goes for corporations. They develop a mission statement, figure out what they're going to do. Churches, this help gurus say you should have a personal mission statement. Probably not a bad idea. So, quick show of hands. How many people could recite the mission statement of the NSCA? A few. All right. True or false? The word research is in the mission statement of the NSCA. True? It is true. The mission statement of the NSCA is this. It says, as the worldwide authority on strength and conditioning, we support and disseminate research-based knowledge and its practical application to improve athletic performance and fitness. So I cheated. I read it off the card. So the question is, why are you an NSCA member? Are you here for networking, which is an important role of a professional organization? Do you use it to promote your business, which is not a bad thing at all? Do you come to the conference to learn? Do you read the journals, or you read the website content to further your education, continuing education, support your certification, use your certification for your business or for your career? The question is, do you believe in the mission statement of the NSCA? You can use the organization and participate in several different levels, but do you believe in the mission of the NSCA? Do you believe that we should be the authority on research-based knowledge and its dissemination? I'll be the first to admit that there's a gap between what practitioners are doing and what researchers are doing, and it's probably growing. And I've been involved in the NSCA for, I don't know, 10, 12 years, I guess, something like that. And I think the gap is probably growing, which is kind of disheartening to me because I do have a background as a coach. I also will put the caveat in there that I don't coach on a daily basis anymore, so I'm not saying that I have the best of both worlds. But research is really important to, obviously, the mission, but it's to the profession of the NSCA, of strength and conditioning. And the idea here is that there's a difference between a trade and a profession. And I'm not saying that a trade is less than a profession, it's just different. Okay? In a trade, we're not necessarily concerned with the why questions as much as we are in a profession. And in a profession, it usually takes a longer educational process, learning process. So the strength and conditioning is a profession. Okay? I worked as a plumber for a while before I went to college, and let me tell you, it's not easy. So I'm not saying that there's something easy about a trade and a profession is better and harder. They're just different. It used to be, the running joke when I was a personal trainer was all you really needed to be able to do to be a personal trainer was count to 10 3 times consecutively, right? But if you're not asking the why questions, you're not really making it into a profession. And that's what research does. Research really asks the why questions or supports the why questions. If you're a coach, you're a problem solver, right? Every day you have this athlete. You need to take them from A to B, different problems. You have things you have to work around. There's all kinds of problems to solve. So what I want to talk about first are these unscientific ways to solve problems, okay? The first one is tenacity, right? You probably hear this a lot. We've always done it this way. Why do you do this? This is the way we've always done it. And I think that comes from the fact of a lot of times of how we develop coaches in the United States. It seems like when I talk to my friends from other countries that the coaching development process is much more formal. A lot of times you'll see this idea of, well, this worked for me when I was an athlete. So all you need to do to really be a coach is to be a successful athlete. Well, you guys know if you're a coach that there are a lot of athletes that are successful in spite of how they train. So this is maybe not the best way to solve some of those problems of figuring out how you're going to take that athlete from A to B. Intuition is another one. If you're a creative person, you're smart people, you cannot be smart and be a coach. You have to have some brain power. You think some things. You think, I think this is a good idea. And that's a good starting point. I mean, those are some of the same types of questions that a researcher is going to ask himself before he or she starts a study. But the other thing is that you have to be able to acknowledge the limitations. Your knowledge is always limited. My knowledge is limited. I only know so much. That's why I like to talk to other people and go to professional organizations and bounce ideas off of each other. So if you're living in a vacuum going by, I feel in my heart that this is the way to do it and this is what I'm going to go do, you still could be making a mistake. It's still not a very scientific way to solve that problem. Whoa. Back one. Authority is another one, right? I do this because so-and-so does it, and he's a good coach, and that's why I should do it. Well, circumstances are different, resources are different, athletes are different. You have to check the source. You know, who are you putting your faith in for your training methods or your coaching methods? It should be a question you should ask yourself. That doesn't mean that you can't learn from experienced people or glean ideas from somebody, but blindly following somebody because you think they're the authority may not be the best idea. You still got to think for yourself. The rationalistic method is one that you'll see quite a bit. If you've ever had a research methods class, you'll probably talk about this, but it takes this idea of a premise, right? A premise is not the same as a statement of fact. A premise is just an assumption for the most part. So I'll give you an example of a correct one. Here, the major premise is that all mammals are warm-blooded. So we can agree with that, right? The minor premise would be that all black dogs are mammals. Therefore, your conclusion is all black dogs are warm-blooded. Okay? That's a correct premise right there. Unfortunately, in coaching, we get these statements that are inferring cause and effect where none exists. Remember, an association is not a causation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get into the checklists, but this is something to be wary of as well. And then the empirical method. Now, one of the characteristics of research that is empirical, but what I'm talking about here is you're gathering your own data from your athletes, which is a good thing to do, in my opinion. So that's a good thing. But again, if you are only limiting yourself to the information from your athletes, you could be doing them a disservice. You could be getting other information from published research, for instance, that might help you to help your athletes a little bit more. Everybody's got their own filters. Science is supposed to be free of bias, which that's surely not true. We try to reduce bias as much as possible, but I've got some things that I think in my gut work and don't work from years of experience as a coach, as an athlete, as a scientist. Now, it doesn't mean I'm willing to state my life on those facts, but yeah, I've got some things that I think work, and that's okay. But again, if you're not willing to test that or at least keep your mind open to other things, you could be, again, selling yourself and your athletes short. So what are some of the characteristics of research in general? Well, first of all, it is systematic. We plan research. Plan, identify, we go out, we collect some data, we analyze it, hopefully we disseminate it. That would be the entire process. It depends on your discipline, but for some disciplines, the idea of research is just going to the library and generating papers, old papers. I know this guy that's at the Vatican working on his PhD, so he spends all his time in the Vatican archives reading old books, right? That's another form of research, but we gather our own data for the most part in exercise science research or strength conditioning research. We'll look at some exceptions to that, but we plan, go out and collect the data, and evaluate it. Again, it's not totally free of bias, but we try to be as objective as possible. If we're doing it right, we're being objective at least. It's also logical. There should be procedures that should be straightforward. Sometimes they may not be clear when they're written down. The procedure should be straightforward, and we should be able to hopefully answer the question with what we've set out to do. It's also reductive. We base these relationships on the data. We try to generalize as much as possible. When you're talking about research ethics and stuff like that, when you define research, they usually define it by the fact is it generalizable? If it's not generalizable, it's not technically research. So we try to gather this data, reduce it down, and then generalize it. Sometimes it's highly generalizable, sometimes it's not, and we'll look at what we call that when they are or are not. It's also replicable. It should be, at least. And this is one of the things that I see as a major problem when I'm reviewing papers, is that the method sections are so poorly written that if I wanted to replicate the study, I couldn't do it, even if I wanted to. A lot of that is due to this black box technology. We're into this phase now where we're making microprocessors that are cheaper, smaller. So all of a sudden, I can, for $1,000, I can go buy this machine. I can plug it in. I get numbers, which were better than I had before, which were sets and reps and volume load, right? But now what do I do with that stuff? Well, there are people that are trying to get research out in journals that are doing the same thing. They're plugging this in. They got these numbers. They couldn't tell you how they got the numbers in the first place. And that's a problem. And then the poor job of reporting actions. Again, it has to be written down so that you can replicate it if you need to. So here's some things to consider when you decide you're going to read the research. First of all, understand that researchers ask relatively narrow questions. Most times we have to. Otherwise, you just can't answer the question. If it's too broad, you can't answer it. Okay? So what this kind of leads to is this idea that you're not going to find one study that's going to generate all of your training theory all at once. There's not that perfect study out there. There's so many variables to look at. It's just not going to happen. We're going to ask pretty narrow questions. You know, the acute training variables is the one that always gets me. You know, you think about all the different things you can manipulate in a training program. For somebody to say that this is the training program that everybody should do or that works the best, that's an awful bold statement to make because there are so many subtle manipulations you can make in a training program that may change the efficacy of that program. Research is often conducted in an artificial environment, right? We take people into the lab so that we can have control. And depending on how much control we have depends on kind of the generalizability of the study, which are the things we're gonna mention several times here today. All methods have limitations, right? There's no perfect method to measure different things. And one of the things that is happening again with this, the advent of technology, is there's more and more different ways to measure different things that sometimes it's not really clear if we're measuring what we intended to measure in the first place. We're doing a good job of it for that matter. Samples are often of convenience, which means that college-age males are predominantly the ones that make up the research studies. Why? Because they're easy to find. They're all over the place, right? Females to a lesser extent, but you know, now we're getting to the point where the granting agencies are making sure that there's equal gender representation, which is a good idea. So that's always going to be a drawback. You know, there are not many high-level athletes that are going to let you manipulate their training program to see if it works or not, right? At that point, they really can't afford to take those types of gambles. That doesn't mean we throw out all training research, right? We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, it's not on athletes. It doesn't mean anything to me. That's not true. And if you're selling yourself short if you take that approach. And the analysis is never simple, right? There's the old saying, garbage in, garbage out. You know, if you've got bad data or data that you don't know anything about, like you know the black box technology, it's going to be very hard to make some sense of that. And again, you can make it as complex or as simple as you want because there are so many different statistical methods as well. We'll mention a little bit about that a little bit later on as well. Another thing to know is that small mistakes can be magnified. Something that a researcher may overlook could have a huge influence on the data. Now, when you're reading research, that stuff's usually harder to pick out. It's harder to pick out those fatal flaws unless you're working in that field a lot, which is why we send out papers for peer review. Hopefully you're sending it out to an expert in that field who will be able to detect those small mistakes that could be magnified, and hopefully those fatal flaws will prevent that paper from being published, at least in that form. Often there's going to be overwhelming detail. I've been reviewing an article. I do a little bit of work in Parkinson's disease research, and so I'm reviewing an article which is, they're measuring force, but it's basically a motor learning study. And I'm telling you, I must have read the methods section at least 4 times already, and I'm still not really sure what they're doing. It's because I'm not a motor learning person. The strength part was pretty simple to me. I understood that. Not getting through the rest of it's a problem. So I think, unfortunately, what happens is that people get into the detail, they read it once or twice, and they're like, oh, I can't do this. I can't read this. Forget it. And it just goes away. And unfortunately, again, there could be an important piece of information in there. Sometimes you're just going to have to grunt through the detail. And hopefully, some of the stuff I'm going to talk about today will help with that. Important information is often missing. I already talked about that with methods section. Sometimes people just glean over something, or they're used to doing these procedures over and over again, so they just don't think about a particular step and they don't write it down, which might be an important step. Don't ever think that published means perfect. There are a lot of journals out there. There's a lot of stuff that gets published that is so-so. So don't ever think that just because it got in print somewhere that it's infallible, okay? And also remember there's no such thing as one study providing proof, okay? You can't say, this study proves X. It's very seldom that you're ever going to be in that situation because of the sheer number of variables that you can look at, especially, again, the acute training variables in training studies. So hard to get answers. It doesn't mean that we, again, throw out the whole thing. It doesn't mean we can't get good pieces of information from those studies. But don't expect that you're going to read one study and then you're never going to have to read research again for the rest of your life. Hopefully, the researcher will acknowledge the limitations of their study. It's kind of an ego check when you're writing up your discussion section and you're going to have to put your limitations in there. What are the limitations or delimitations in some cases? Oftentimes people don't want to admit that their study's not perfect, right? Because you put so much time and effort into the study. But hopefully the reviewers are going to make sure that that ends up in there. If I'm a reviewer and I'm seeing a study and they don't have any limitations at all, I'm really wondering what they really did. Because you got to acknowledge that there's going to be some limitations. So again, don't think that one study is going to solve all the problems. The other thing to remember is that if you want to be an expert on a topic, you have to be an evaluator of the research. You have to be able to go through that research and make sense of it. One study is not going to prove it. You're going to have to read several studies, and it might be a large body of research. So I think it's to think of this as a process more than a destination. So know that you're going to be doing this over a period of time. There's a great article, if you can pull up this link sometime and read it, called Chaos in the Brickyard. It was written in '63. And the guy does a great job of talking about the research process. He basically says it's like building buildings. When you do a study, you make a brick. You get a bunch of studies together, you take that brick and you put it together and you make an edifice. You make a building, you form a theory or a law. Remember, he wrote this in '63, by the way, right? So the parallel is that what ended up happening is we're suffering from an abundance of poorly made bricks, and nobody's building any buildings. Where we did a poor job training the next generation of scientists. All they came up with was the idea that all they need to do is create a brick, which is get a published thing. A tenure and promotion stuff is based on this idea of how long is your vita. Well, mine's 14 pages long. Well, okay, you're granted tenure. Doesn't matter, in a lot of cases, it doesn't matter where they're published. Stuff like that. So again, 1963 this guy wrote this, and it's still true today. So pull that up and read it. I think it draws a really good parallel to what we're suffering from today, and maybe will help you, put the right color glasses on when you interpret the research. All right, there are different types of research out there. Different types of analytical research would be like historical things. Philosophic research, things that you may come across more often in strength and conditioning would be reviews. You could call it a qualitative review or a narrative review. Basically, somebody does the best they can to summarize the studies. There's also another type of review called a research synthesis or a meta-analysis. This is more of a quantitative type thing where you're actually making numerical comparisons between studies. I tend to think it's kind of underutilized in strength conditioning research, but there are some really good ones out there. They've been published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, but they've looked at things like volume load, optimal number of sets, stuff like that, and they've kind of done their best job to numerically put together the information that's out there. The other good thing that these types of studies do is they look at the quality of the study. There are different scales to talk about the quality of the study. Did they randomize their subjects, et cetera, which are actually some of the things we're going to talk about in a little bit. So those are good to find if you can find them. There's a couple on plyometrics out there that I've looked at recently. Another type of research is descriptive. Again, this is usually cross-sectional, snapshot in time. I go out to a bunch of people, I give them a bunch of questionnaires, interviews, some sort of normative survey. I may distribute it electronically so I can distribute it nationwide. There are other types of descriptive research that we come across in strength and conditioning, things like case studies, which are important. The idea of a case study is you're getting a whole bunch of information from a very small number of subjects, maybe down to one. It could be very rare cases. So case studies are important. They're less generalizable in a lot of cases because there's such a small sample. But it doesn't mean that we can't get good information from them. There are different types of observational research. I put TMA, stands for time motion analysis. So things like, how long does the average American football play last? Well, it lasts about 4 seconds. Okay, well, how long is the average rest period? Well, about a minute. Does that influence how I do my conditioning for football players? I hope so. That's a good type of observational research that is very practical that we can put to work right away. There's also developmental studies looking at changes through childhood and adolescence. Also very important things as we get more and more young athletes wanting to participate. Other types of correlational studies, and remember, correlation does not imply causation. You can show that two things are related, that they don't, but not necessarily that one causes the other. I think the classic example you always hear is that in kids, shoe size is related to IQ. That's because kids with bigger feet are smarter. Well, kids with bigger feet are older. They score better on the IQ exam. So correlation is not causation, something to keep in mind. And then you've got epidemiology, but you can't open the newspaper, open a newspaper as if anybody opens a newspaper. You can't look on the web, on a news site, and see something that didn't talk about some health study. Yesterday it was that fish oil is going to give you prostate cancer. Anybody see that one? That was the new one yesterday. I haven't even read it. All I know that was the new one, is that now there's, again, association, not a causation, association between people that took a lot of fish oil and people that got prostate cancer. We'll see where that one goes. True experimental research is what we're going to talk about today. We work to establish cause and effect. We manipulate variables, we control variables. Hopefully we can get closer to answering those cause and effect questions. There's also qualitative research, which we don't see very often in strength and conditioning. I'm not a qualitative person. We have some qualitative people in our university at the College of Education, but it's not something that I do. But just be aware that that's another type of research. There's a continuum of basic to applied research. Right? If you remember when the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research started, it was JASSR, right? The Journal of Applied Sports Science Research. So they were looking for applied research, and it still to this day is an applied journal. On the one end of this continuum, you've got basic research. They have a lot of high internal validity. What does that mean? Well, you're controlling a lot of variables. Things that are done in a test tube, in a closed lab, controlled conditions, right? It's very much theory-driven. You're answering very basic questions. It may not be, the answer to that research may not be something that you're going to put into practice tomorrow, but it might lead to other studies, which might lead to other studies, which might lead to eventually to something that's very practical that you can apply. We're in a situation now where it seems like people believe that this is the best type of research. I guess it's because it gets big headlines or it gets big money from granting agencies. You know, if you can isolate a stem cell or something like that, or these types of things are, I'm not saying it's not important. I just think that there's value across this continuum is what I'm arguing here. Then somewhere in the middle you have this moderate relevance stuff. The goal is still theory-based, but you're using very much relevant procedures. So, we could say that maybe a training study done on college-age people might be a moderate relevance thing if you're trying to apply it to athletes, because you're still using a theory, it's just that maybe it's not directly applicable because of your sample. And then on the other end of this continuum, we've got applied research. So we got a lot of high external validity. External validity just means the generalizability. Now again, there's not a good or a bad in this continuum. You've got basic research over here with a lot of internal validity. You've got applied research over here with external validity, and a study may fall somewhere along that continuum, anywhere from between those two ends. This is the type of stuff that you're most likely to see, though, in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. Why? Well, at the end of that paper, you're going to see the practical applications page. They want to know what the applications of it are. If there aren't any applications, it's probably not going to get published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. Now, when you start to read the research, one thing you have to remember is that the writing style can sometimes be difficult. And again, I think this is one of the places where the researchers are really falling short. They're not making their writing style straightforward. I teach a scientific writing class. For instance, one of the things they talk about is repeating key terms. You repeat the key term over and over again so the reader can follow the story. If you call the same thing 5 different terms, you're making it unnecessarily complex for the reader. And this happens all the time. There's a great W.C. Fields quote. It says, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with BS. And I think that's, in a lot of cases, that's what's going on. The researchers are doing their best to make themselves sound as smart as possible, and in that process, they're doing a poor job of disseminating that research. So if you're going to read this research, you're going to have to become familiar with the relevant publications in your area of work. I've talked about the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. We're at the NSCA conference. It makes perfect sense. Are there other good journals out there? Absolutely. It's not the only thing you should read. But if you are a member, you're already getting it, or at least electronic access to it, so it's there for you. I mean, there's a wealth of information that's waiting there if you choose to dig into it. So, the first thing you need to do is read the abstract. I think a lot of people, when they get the journal in the mail or whatever, or they get the table of contents update, they're like, oh man, I've got to read this thing from cover to cover. You don't have to read it cover to cover. Not everything in there is going to be relevant to you and your athletes. But browsing the titles and then reading the abstracts of the titles that kind of excite you a little bit is a good way to get into it. There's nothing wrong with reading the abstract and saying, you know what, this is not what I thought it was. I'm not going to go into the paper. There's no guilt involved in that. Just because you start reading it doesn't mean you have to finish it. The other thing that happens is this idea of significance. Everybody gets into the statistics. It's either significant or it's not, as if it was that black and white, and it's really not, let me tell you. Look for things like the magnitude of the effect. Percent changes, or we'll talk about a measure called effect size. If you can get to those types of things, then you will really be getting to the applied aspect of that study. And then also be critical but objective. Remember, don't discount every training study just because it doesn't use high-level athletes if you work with high-level athletes. It doesn't mean that there's no information that can't be gotten from that. So if you find a mistake, don't throw the whole thing out, or you find a shortcoming or a limitation, don't throw it out. Take it for what it's worth, and then move on. All right, so we're going to change gears a little bit. We're going to ask some questions that the reader should be asking themselves as they're wading through a paper. The first thing that you're going to come across after you've read the abstract is the introduction. And I'll say right now that some of what I'm going to say about introductions also applies to literature reviews as well. So these same types of questions you can ask for literature reviews. It should demonstrate the importance of whatever the research question is. Now, keep in mind, not everything is going to be relevant to everybody in there. So it may be important to somebody, just not important to you. But it is up to the author of that paper to demonstrate that it is important. They shouldn't just assume that you think it's important. They should provide an overview of the literature. If it's an introduction to a research paper, it's only going to be about 3 to 5 paragraphs. It's not supposed to be an exhaustive review of the literature, but it should be enough to place the research question in context. If it's written well enough, as a matter of fact, you as the reader should be able to ask the question. If they've done a good job of writing the introduction, the question should be very, very clear by the time they get there, because they've said, this is why it's important, this is what's missing, the need for the study, this is the gap in the literature, and this is what we're going to fill in. So, as you're reading that introduction, you ask yourself, is the problem area identified? Did they lay that out? Most importantly, they should lay it out early. You shouldn't have to wade through a whole lot of detail before you know what the study is about. Right? And I think that's another place where the researchers are falling short. Be upfront right away, let the reader know why they're getting into this, then give them the relevant background information on that. Is it justified? Why are they doing the research? Is it based on statistics? They're doing a study on heart disease because heart disease kills so many people. Are they doing it, they're doing a study on different training volumes because it's an area of controversy, right? Are they establishing these reasons as to why this is important? Are they talking about the theories that are involved? The general adaptation syndrome, something like that, anything. Is there a theory involved, or is it just a very straightforward descriptive study? If there's no giant, overwhelming theory, that doesn't mean it's a bad study as well. But if there are theories out there as to why one is better than the other, are they discussing it? One of the things that drives me crazy when I'm reading it is when they do the study-by-study thing instead of topic-by-topic, right? I don't want to see this author found this, next paragraph, this author found this, third paragraph, this author found this, right? What I tell my students is I want you to weave a thread between the studies. Is it things that found similar things at the end, or studies that use similar methods? It's not just a study-by-study review. If it is, it's probably a beginner's mistake, because that really doesn't help you develop the question. It just says this is what's known. It doesn't really talk about the unknown or why there might be discrepancies in different people's data. You always hear this, people who want to discount research say, well, you find 5 studies that work and I can find you 5 studies that say it doesn't work. Well, that's great. Why? Why are they different? Probably not random. There's probably some systematic difference between those studies. That's why reading the research can help you figure that out. If it's a really long introduction, sometimes you might see subheadings, or if it's a review, you might see subheadings. So you have to ask yourself, are the subheadings appropriate? Are they putting it into proper content areas? You may come across an introduction that doesn't have subheadings. In that case, it just doesn't apply. Do they provide good definitions, either for the variables, what they're testing, et cetera? Again, it should be very much jargon-free. Unfortunately, I've come across some stuff here lately where one example was a guy was talking about a warm-up routine, and he listed, we did this exercise, and I can't remember what it was called, but something I'd never heard of before. Now, granted, I'm not a coach, I'm not in the trenches. Maybe everybody knew this exercise, what it was called, some sort of warm-up drill. But you got to define that type of stuff. People have to know. It has to be replicable. If I don't know what that exercise is, can't remember what it was, honestly, but Frankenstein or something like that, which I think I knew what it was, you know. Walk and touch your toes, a little hamstrings, a little dynamic warm-up. But like they could have just said walking toe touches as well. That would have been a little bit more descriptive. Maybe that's a poor example, but you get my point. The other big issue that I come across a lot is people assuming fact where it doesn't exist. So for instance, you'll see a sentence that makes a statement of fact and it's not referenced. Well, we all know that. Everybody knows that. It's like, well, if there's not a reference to support it, I'm not really sure. There's nothing wrong with stating your opinion in a paper or as a coach. Nobody's going to fault you for ever stating your opinion. It's when you state your opinion as this is fact because I say it is, that's when it leads to issues. So there's nothing wrong with making a statement. If it's a statement of fact, back it up with a reference. If not, state it as an opinion. Not a problem at all. The other thing that we come across is this idea of the purposes, questions, hypotheses. Are they clear? Again, if it's properly written, you should be able to pick it out no problem. You should be able to write the purpose statement of the study if the introduction is well written. So make sure that you know why you're reading the study by that point. All right. As we get into the methods, we start to ask some more complicated questions. First of all, are the groups randomized? All right? Now, don't ever get this confused with random selection, right? We do research mostly on volunteers, so it's a random allocation. So are they randomized? Do you get, somehow random numbers table, whatever it is, you're in group A, you're in group B. You get supplement A, you get supplement B, whatever it is. That is one of the main keys to true experimental research. If it's not randomized, it doesn't mean that it's not a good study. It just means it's different. Okay? It's just not a true randomized design. It means that it has an inherent limitation. Doesn't mean it's bad, doesn't mean we throw it out. We just acknowledge the limitation. Are the groups equal at the beginning? Okay, so even if you do a random assignment, especially if your n size is relatively small, you might have differences in your groups at the beginning. So you need to do some sort of analysis to figure out, are they different? If they haven't made the point to you as the reader that their groups were similar at the beginning, then there's an inherent flaw in that research. That's really going to limit the generalizability of that study. Sometimes you have a one-group design. In that case, the order of the treatments should be randomized. So again, we're inducing some way to make it as generalizable as possible. It will be less generalizable than a random allocation, but it still can be useful. Is the sample adequately described? Again, if it's going to be replicable, they have to describe who they have. Men, women, age, weight, whatever it may be. Whatever descriptive variables might influence the outcomes should be listed there. If it's a pilot study, which means it's more exploratory, typically a smaller n size, may not have the same statistical analysis, the question you ask is the demographic correct? Because what they're doing is they're trying to generate at least some sort of small amount of information that they can use and go apply to a bigger population. Well, if they're using the right demographic in the small one, they should easily be able to move into the next study. If they're going to make a major switch, all they're really going to end up doing is having to go back and do another pilot study. And then a big kicker is this question of adequate size. And unfortunately, there's a really poor understanding, I think, of what an adequate size is. It all goes back to the statistical analysis. You can have an n size of 1,000 people, and you can find a lot of significant things that might be just about meaningless. Okay? You can also have a very small n size, and you can have very large differences that don't come out as statistically significant. So there's a relationship between significance, hypothesis testing, and sample size. So there's not a number that I can give you right now that says this is the adequate sample size, but it's a question you should ask in the context of how they're going to analyze the data. If it's a pilot study, it's a pilot study. They've got a convenient sample of how many people they could get. There's nothing wrong with that. If they're doing a study in a line of research that's been relatively well established, they should have done some sort of sample size analysis that showed you why they chose as many subjects as they did. If they don't, that's a limitation. Now, as they talk about the different variables in the methods, you have to be able to categorize them. So the independent variable, hopefully most of you have heard this, that's going to be the manipulated variable. So I randomly allocate these two groups. I'm going to manipulate one variable, either a training program, supplement, whatever the case may be, and I'm going to test them over time. The categorical or moderator variables are the descriptive variables, gender, those types of things. Then the dependent variable will be my outcome. So what is the end result? Am I looking at changes in body composition, changes in performance, changes in body weight? You know, could be any number of those things, could be several of those things, right? The control variable things are the ones that you're going to control for, hence the name control variable. So for instance, I might control for the time of day in which people train, or the time of day in which they test, or what they eat for a certain period of time. All those things can be controlled for, and that, again, puts us back on that continuum between basic and applied research. I can have a whole lot of control, or I can have not so much control. That's going to influence the generalizability of the information. Not good or bad, just on a continuum. And then you have your extraneous variables. Those would be the ones that people forgot, and then at the end they realize, oh, if I would have controlled for that, I actually have some decent results here. So look for those variables. Make sure that they're controlling what they should be controlling for. Okay, as you get further into the methods section, you're going to come across maybe instrumentation or procedure, something like that. Questions you should ask yourself. Have they clearly identified the variables that they're going to measure? Are the researchers trained? That's a tough question to answer, especially from reading a paper. Now, if they're citing themselves a whole bunch in that paper, they're probably reasonably well trained in what they're doing. If you write a grant application, this is one of the things that people look at really close. I'm going to give you a bunch of money to do some research. I want to be reasonably sure that you're going to be able to pull it off. Just reading a published paper, that's harder to get sometimes, but it's something you should be considering at least. What are the reliability of the measures, right? If they measure this variable over and over again, are they likely to be able to detect true differences in the data, or is it just random? This is one of the things, again, that gets awful light, it seems to me, in journals these days. People develop a new method, and they go out and start testing hypotheses with, and they haven't even established the fact that is it reliable, is it valid? They haven't done those types of things. So if they don't at least say that we've got some reliability data, typically ICC is the best. There's reasons why you don't use Pearson R for reliability. Or at least a citation that shows that they're using a reliable measure, then I would question that data for sure. Calibration of equipment is another one. You know, again, if this black box mentality that appears to be prevalent these days is you can get information, you can get data, no problem. The question is it good data? Is it reliable? Is it repeatable? Those types of things. And a lot of that has to do with calibration. You know, does your force plate read the right forces when it's supposed to? You know, I use these homemade force plate setups sometime where you have to put a known weight on there and make sure that the current is reading right. If you don't, you can end up with all kinds of crazy stuff. But people just don't do that. Sometimes it's expensive if you've got to run sample gases through your VO2, you know, your metabolic cart, stuff like that. But sometimes it's just laziness or forgetfulness, whatever it is. But it's a very, very important thing. They should talk about when they calibrated their devices. Did they calibrate it daily, weekly, what it was? The idea of blinding. Okay, a lot of times we think about this in supplement studies. Double blind would mean that neither the researcher nor the research subject knows what they're getting. Are they getting the real thing or the placebo? What we don't often think about this is we're talking about training studies. In a perfect world, the evaluator of a training study would be blind to which arm of training they were in. Okay? That's why we need a lot of worker bees in the lab to be able to get that kind of information. Sometimes that's not always possible. So they should talk about blinding. Another thing that might come up, for instance, if you're talking about a training study, is the idea of compliance. Say, well, they train 3 times a week for 6 weeks. Well, if they miss one training session, do they get booted out of the study? Two training sessions? 3? 4? Missed a whole week? They have to have some idea of compliance. They have to know how many they did. Do they have some sort of cutoff? You know, a lot of times we'll say we expect that everybody's going to make 85% of their training sessions. And that may be arbitrary, but at least you've got something to start with, right? Are they really doing what they're supposed to be doing? And then now that you know this trade-off between internal and external validity, you can ask yourself where you think where on that continuum that study lands, and how generalizable is this going to be, or is this just going to lead to more research, more of a theory, that type of stuff. Getting into the results section will always be confusing, right? The famous quote is there's 3 types of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. This has been attributed to Winston Churchill at one time. Mark Twain's actually the one who said it. He attributed it to Benjamin Disraeli, but nobody ever wrote down that Disraeli actually said that. So I guess anybody can claim it at this point. You can make a lot of things look important with statistics, okay? That's why it's up to you, the reader, to ask these tough questions like, did they start out with a normal distribution? Because if they're using a normal, a parametric test for their analysis, they better have normal data. If they don't, you got a big problem. Now, most of the tests that we use are pretty robust against non-normality, but it doesn't mean they're perfect. Ask about the magnitude of the effect, okay? One of the simplest measures you can give is a percentage. However, a percentage can still be influenced by one crazy data point, right? Or several crazy data points. A better way to look at it in many cases is a measure of effect size, which is nothing but the difference between the means in terms of standard deviations. So this group did 1 standard deviation better than the other, or this training method did 1 or 2 standard deviations better than the other. It gives us a magnitude. Many of you who know who Will Hopkins is, he's got a great website, sportsci.org, where he has a statistics section where he gives you a table to kind of estimate the magnitude of effects and how meaningful they really are. Remember, statistical significance is highly influenced by sample size, right? You can have something that is meaningful and not significant. Likewise, you can have something that is significant but not meaningful or clinically applicable. So don't confuse those terms. Significance should only be used when you're talking about statistics. The meaningfulness of it is not 100% reflective or reflected by the significance. Another important question to ask yourself is attrition. So for instance, say you had 2 different training arms, right? So we're going to do 1 sets versus 3 sets. Randomly allocated, the groups are the same at the beginning. However, I find out that 50% of the people in the single set group quit. That's an important measure. If I'm talking about the efficacy of a training program, people don't want to do the training program. It's not a very good training program. Now, I'm not saying anything, I'm not making a statement of single versus multiple sets. Could be the 3-set group people quit because there was too much time, whatever the case may be. But ask yourself, is there differential attrition? One of the things that you'll see in some of the epidemiology research is what they call, I had a friend that did some smoking research, but they call it intention to treat. The idea is that if I put you in a smoking cessation program and you disappear from the program, I'm assuming you're still smoking, right? So statistically, I treat that differently. I expect that there's been some reason why you quit and that it leads to the efficacy of that program. All right, then in the discussion. Do they give you a summary of what they're doing? Okay, that's a good way to start the discussion. Okay, just to remind you what the research question is. Do they acknowledge the limitations somewhere in there? Again, they don't have to say their study is crap, they just have to acknowledge that there's some limitations. Do they place their data in the context of the body of literature? So you should see a lot of the references from the introduction are repeated, and now they're placing their piece of the puzzle in this body of literature. Do they have suggestions for future research? Not, more research is needed. What a stupid statement that would be. Sure, there's more research needed, especially in a very complex topic. What should be researched next? In the author's opinion, what is the next logical step in this research? Have they distinguished between speculation and database conclusions? I don't mind if somebody speculates in a paper. However, if they're trying to pass it off as fact when they haven't established it as fact, that's when it becomes a problem. You know, researchers have the ability to speculate a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. Always remember that correlation is not causation. And then look for some of these words: applications, recommendations, implications. Do they give some of those? Do they all mean the same thing? Not really. As a matter of fact, let's look at that. An application is a use. This is the continuum of certainty. So in the journal Strength Conditioning Research, we have practical applications, right? That's the use. Here's how you use this paper, okay? Recommendations would be advising actions, okay? A little less concrete, right? Then you have implications. That would be a tentative logical step by definition. So we're getting a little less certain on this continuum here. And then you have speculations. It's an imaginative leap, but at least it's reasonable, right? It's a reasonable imaginative leap. Also look for these helping verbs, things like can, will, should, must, okay? Those are quite a bit different than may, might, probably. The longer I do research and the more I look at stuff, the more I start to use these unsure helping verbs like may, might, probably, because there are a lot of different things that can go on that can influence the outcome. Be very aware of things like this is a rule or a law or this has been proven. Okay? Not very often do we get that type of stuff in strength conditioning research. So, at the end, you're tying it all together. You ask yourself, is the problem important? Were the researchers reflective? All that really means is, do they give a lot of why statements? This is why this happened. This is why we did what we did. Those types of things. That's an important thing to talk about. The whys of how they put that together. Is it cohesive? Does it make sense? Do they go off on odd tangents that just don't seem to kind of follow the line? Does it really add to the body of literature? In the discussion, they better have told you how it adds to the body of literature. Is it likely to foster more research? This would be a question that might be more applied to a basic study. Or is it likely to affect practice, which is a very practical question. All right, so I got a little over 5 minutes left. Let's sum it up. Researchers, this is what you can do if you're in the audience, and I'm doing my best to do these things. Take time to educate yourself in the practitioner's domain. I'm not a coach. I have tremendous respect for coaches. I've got a good friend who coaches a lot of hours, and he's telling me a lot of stories about everything that's expected of him by his athletic directors and stuff like that. I have tremendous respect for what you do. And it would help a lot of exercise science, strength and conditioning research if the scientists got in the weight room once in a while and actually saw what strength coaches had to deal with. You can also educate yourself on scientific writing. When we produce scientists, hardly ever do we educate them on how to write. It's either something that they learn by trial and error, which can take an awful long time, or they never learn it and they never really write good papers. Doesn't mean they don't get published, it's that they just don't ever write anything good. There's a great textbook out there that I'm using in my class called Scientific Writing and Communication. I use it and I've learned a ton from it. I think it's great. I think it should be mandatory for scientists to have some sort of scientific writing class. And then also write for the practitioner where appropriate. Most of the time, if somebody's writing for JSCR, they know they should be writing for the practitioner, and they will do so. But it's also up to the authors to remind themselves that that's what they're supposed to do, and the reviewers, and the editors, et cetera, to make sure that they're writing for the practitioner. All right, coaches, what can you do? Well, the whole point of this thing is to get you to study and apply the research the best you can. Contact your local researchers and get involved. I've been at the University of Memphis long enough to have situations where we have great relationships with the strength staff and non-existent relationships with the strength staff. It hasn't really been volatile. They've either been good or non-existent, so I guess that's probably okay. So now we're at a stage, I think, where things are going to be pretty good. So it really allows us to get together and talk shop, the positive thing. Promote the application of research to your colleagues in the coaching field, especially if you're a head coach and you've got assistant coaches working for you or graduate assistants working for you. If you can establish the habit of getting them into the research, then they're going to go out and continue that habit. And when they become head coaches, hopefully people that are working for them will do the same thing, and we can change the culture. If you are an undergraduate and you're going on to get your master's degree and you want to be a strength conditioning coach, seek a place where you can get the best of both worlds, where you can get the practical strength and conditioning time in the weight room working with athletes, but also you can learn how to be a research consumer. We tell our graduate students that we don't expect that everybody's going to come out of here and go and get a PhD or go into a research job. But everybody that comes out of our master's program ought to be able to get through the research, be able to read a paper and interpret a paper, no matter what they do. End up personal training, strength conditioning coaching, going on to the healthcare field, which some of our people do, they should be able to get into the research. So, that is the mission statement of the NSCA. I thank you very much for your attendance. Please, please, please fill out those speaker evaluations. They're extremely important for me and for the organization. Please take your time. I'm out of time. I will hang out in the hallway, and you can feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you very much.